Hello, everyone, and welcome to Dr. Deep State. The show today is entitled The Fear of the Jews, and it's by Father Francois Chazal. He's a French person, he's a father, and it's going to be a three-part series. And I'm going to give you sort of an overview what I'm going to do here on YouTube with us. I think the big picture of what I'm doing here, I will lay out on YouTube. This is going to be a three-part video, and it gets into very sensitive topics. Part 2 and 3 are going to be over on Locals, where I really dig into it. And by the way, if you want to go over to Locals, it's free to be a member. Some of the material, there's a Telegraph available over there with an amazing conversation by the members and the supporters. And you're going to be able to access many of the articles, but the main bulk of the content is going over there for supporters, and that's $5 a month if you're interested in supporting the channel. Throughout the next 6 months, my intention is to be doing 3 to 4 pieces of new content each week over there on the Locals. So the big picture of what I'm up to here is really mixing up the deep state and making sense of that. This channel is called the Dr. Deep State channel. And some of what I want to do is to go back to the very beginning of Dr. Deep State, which began 7 years ago with an investigation of what is the deep state. And what I'm going to do is re-explore that evolution. So I'm going back today to one of the earliest videos and just kind of thinking about what the mechanics are of the deep state and asking a fundamental question. Why is it so difficult for people to get their heads around this concept? And part of my evolution is that I realized over time that it's fundamentally a theological concept, and it's part cardinal, worldly, and part metaphysical. So I'm going to play a little bit of one of the very earliest videos and do some reflection on that. And then I'm going to go for an explanation here to Father Chazal, the French priest. And what I'm going to do is kind of, again, juxtapose this with many series I've been doing, this memory holding of the cosmic conspiracy. My first book was Seeing Through the Singularity, and that's uncovering the cosmic conspiracy. So that book and the current book, In Pursuit of the Metaverse, I'll put links for the Metaverse down below and a link to the Locals channel, are a product of thinking through the deep state concept. So the first 104 videos on this channel are dedicated to a scholarly assessment of what the deep state is. And most of that scholarship comes from specific scholarship devoted to the deep state and my background in international relations studies. So one of the questions I think we could think about here is, what is the deepest source of the deep state? And to answer that, what I eventually came to discover for myself was that it's theological and related to sacred scripture. And I came to realize in my own personal journey that it requires an understanding of reality in its fullest sense. So what the channel has evolved to, it's really taking two things together. Catholicism, which is the universal church, and the deep state, and working those together. And that's why I'm so happy with what's going on Locals and the Telegraph. It's truly that. It's really a mixture with some great contributions from our Locals members of really putting those things together. Theology through the lens of Catholicism. And Catholicism in its fullest sense is not just a lens, but it's an experience. It's the totality of the experience that really surpasses even time and space, and our participation in that experience, and understanding the deep state. And so we think about what's the source of this what's the source of the deep state? What is the agenda of the deep state? And I'll be asking that in a moment. And what's great about what Father Chazal adds to that is he's doing precisely what all the memory hold thinkers I have so far discussed. He's consistent with all of those thinkers. What is the cosmic conspiracy? And he's got some really special insights because he's a contemporary thinking about the events that have happened over the last 5 years. And he's got special insight, I think, into the deep state. So I was very happy to discover Father Chazal. And he's going to use slightly different concepts, but a lot of the concepts that I use, like the simulacrum and the egregore, he will use the same concepts using his own wording. So it's an adjunct to what I've been discussing, and he's got some interesting insights into it. So I'm going to talk about him only briefly on YouTube. It's touchy stuff, and I have to go into the bulk of it over on Locals. And then the question, when we sort of start to discover the deep state and its theological implications, what do you do with that as a Christian? Do you ignore it? Do you move on? Do you just say it's not important and cherry pick events in your life that you think are important? So Father Chazal has some very specific suggestions for how to deal with that. And I think they're consistent with the suggestions given by the doctors of the church and saints throughout the ages. I would like to say more members of the current church over the last 50 to 75 years, but there are fewer and fewer. So what does that mean? How do we deal with this information? So we're going to go into him a little bit about that. And specifically, how do we respond? So let me begin by pulling up a video and thinking about this question from the anatomy of the deep state. Now, when I began this course, I knew where I was going. I developed it along with my book, The Singularity, but I began it the first many videos before I started talking about the singularity and the cabal and things like that. I was here just addressing the mechanics of the deep state when I was asking this question here. The anatomy of a deep state. It was written by Mike Lofgren. He was a 28-year insider in Washington, D.C., specializing in national security. And at first, it seemed like the article was quite explosive. It was followed up by a PBS interview with Bill Moyers. And largely, we can say it didn't go anywhere in terms of the public consciousness, or certainly in terms of academia. So I'm going to make a comment right there. This happens over and over. There's these sort of explosive events. It seems like people are, quote unquote, waking up to the deep state or a deeper sense of reality. But in this case here, I believe I discuss it pretty briefly, but this hits sort of the mainstream, at least PBS, and a definite respected insider is laying it out. There is such a thing as this concept called the deep state. So the sort of face value textbook concept of politics, he's fundamentally challenging here. I'm going to discuss a little bit about what the article said, but essentially I want you to actually read the article and then address the questions that I've posed for today. So Mr. Lofgren essentially says that when you go to Washington, D.C., there's the visible government that you see, the government that you hear about in college classrooms and political science classes, the government that you see on television, and then there's what he calls the deep state, and suggests that's the real government. He breaks it down so it works essentially like this. It's not every piece of government in the United States, but it is the core parts of the government, especially the federal government, the branches that we think of, the executive, the judicial, the congressional branch, law enforcement, national security, the essential and core pieces of all those federal branches, and then the connections to the state level of government as well. And I think if I were going to suss this up, Mr. Lofgren would say that there's two essential nodes. There's the security, the national security apparatus in Washington, D.C., and the Wall Street piece over here. And there is a relationship. I'll just cut in for a second. Peter Dale Scott is probably the preeminent thinker on the deep state. And he had, I think I go into that in the next couple of videos, but that's precisely his point. The center of power is really what we could call Wall Street, or today what we'd probably call the corporations, namely places like Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock. And so they're really at even the pinnacle of Wall Street. Just to kind of cut in there, here, I think most countries follow this model of, in terms of their lawmaking, and it can be statistically traced that virtually all laws now at the federal level are written through some kind of direct, it can be traced to a direct connection to these, we could call it the commanding heights of the economy. So essentially, it really is the corporate class. And we have to untangle exactly what a corporation is here. But what I'm saying here is what Lofgren is saying is consistent with what Peter Dale Scott would be saying. From the two that he leaves somewhat undefined, but all other pieces of the deep state consist around this core relationship between the national security apparatus and Wall Street. So the questions that I have for you today are, number one, why an article that was seemingly so explosive, that questioned the very idea of politics that we see before us, that really questioned the fundamental assumptions of political science as it's taught to us in our colleges and universities, why this didn't make more headway. There could be a number of reasons, but bear in mind, if you look at the article, the PBS article, it's followed through with a number of sort of PBS go-to talking heads, a number of them that kind of just say, oh, of course there's a deep state, like take it for granted. So if it's sort of an assumed phenomena, why didn't PBS itself follow through? Why didn't it make it into mainstream news? Why is it still not discussed in colleges and universities? So I'll stop there just for a moment, and I'm going to, this little segment here is short, and it's going to be over in just a minute, and I'll repeat the question in the segment, and I'll just suggest it to me. What's going on that just the term deep state? So this was produced in 2017, reflecting on an article from 2014. Where have we come? The term deep state at this point was absolutely new. It wasn't in the public consciousness. So have we come at, like, when we go out into public, just anecdotally, if you say the deep state to somebody, what kind of look are you going to get? And I think things have changed. I think that in terms of there's a segment of society that's sort of open to that and get it, and say they're comfortable with the term. They're not scared off from it. But what is it going? I mean, this is kind of about really collective psychology. The question at this point is, why does it not get through to us? And just one quick note here. Here's where we're going with Father Chazal. It's metaphysical in origin. There's something about the operators of the deep state that when we think in theological and metaphysical terms, they have sort of a license to do what they do. And we could also mix in a little bit of collective psychology, like what exactly is going on that people just don't want to see it or are incapable of seeing it. And we've seen so many things happen in the last 5 years, like the events over the last several years that happened around the world in lockstep. And it seems to be a small minority of people that can kind of see through what's going on. And those people see it like so blatantly. But yet there's other people today that are still driving around in their cars with masks on by themselves. Uh, Father Francois here would say one thing he'd liken this to is that look you get when you say, "How do two planes knock down three buildings?" And you get either that sort of fluoride stare, just that stare, and people that just disengage, or they give you that look. I think he wrote that he's French, but he wrote it in English. It's a little clunky in some parts and very powerful in others. But he say if they don't outright his words call you a conspiracy nut. And so there is something very deep. And one of the terms I came up with, he comes up the word specter, which is very similar to the word egregore. There's some kind of demonic ontology attached to the thought form of information that we're getting through our textbooks and in the mainstream. So it's very strange that people, when they're presented with something that is inconsistent with what those in authority say, there is a challenge. And so, what do we do with this information? Well, let me just cut to the chase before I continue. At the end of the day, Father Chazal will say that this phenomenon, at its very root, is the fear of the Jews. It's been suppressed, it's there. And what they're really kind of wondering, these days, if you say, how did two planes knock down three buildings? And deep down, they can't pull it up oftentimes, but it's like, are you anti Semitic? Where are you going with this? And he said, until we address this at the very root, this is going to be played out in this fashion. The church historically dealt with this at the root in the 20th century, late 20th century, and 21st century. We don't address our own individual fears. And certainly the opposite is oftentimes true. Um, what did happen in the spring of 2017 is the deep state as a term made it into the mainstream news. It didn't make it into the news in any kind of way that was definable or that is referred to with any sense of consensus, but it did make it. So I don't know if there's a connection. There's sort of seeds were planted back then and sort of it was made. I'm just going to reflect on this. So the way it was revealed, sometimes these are called controlled revelations. So it's done in some sort of, we got the academic work where you can kind of peel parts of it minus the metaphysics. And that's important. And because the point that Father Chazal was going to say is if you look at this in the cardinal, you are addressing a cardinal power that has a right to do what they're doing. Until you address it in the spiritual, you can't address this. But what I think is interesting about this, what was about to come up, is Trump is going to blow up this concept. I am going to rid the swamps. I'm going to take on the deep state. And it just doesn't take much thinking. You don't have to have studied political science to understand that the deep state are these sort of more permanent bureaucracy. And this deep state exists in all countries. And it's profound in the United States. It's almost a model for this. And the idea that you can at one time have all of your, not all, everybody in any kind of important position of decision-making, foreign or domestic, that literally has dual citizenship, which on its face should be treason, and nobody addresses that. And those same decision makers, with slight variations, mostly all still dual citizens, by definition, meaning they have more loyalty to another country. I guess it's illegal to say that now. Or at least shifting loyalties to, I think about it. Okay, so they're all still there. He just took, whether you're talking about, sorry to be a little American here, Bush, or Obama, go back to Clinton, come jump up to Trump, the current administration here. It's the same essential actors with the same essential agenda with the same connections to BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, and to keep them in power and somehow say you're going to get rid of them, or to somehow shift it, which has been done, that the deep state are, it's labor or it's the Democrats, is it's somebody that just, and I guess that's the part of the controlled narrative, is that it's just the people you don't like in power. So it was just the definition and the concept were just pulverized with the revelation of the concept itself. And it's only several years later, and after QOps and whatnot, that you see this the diabolical genius in these kind of controlled revelations. It manifest in 2017. That's something we could figure out. We can trace any kind of developments between 2014 and 2017. More recently, the Secretary of State Tillerson suggests that the seventh floor of the State Department is sort of this elite shadow government, something that would be unthinkable to speak about even a year or two ago, that there's sort of this seventh floor deep state. And is this the same deep state that Lofgren is referring to? And if so, finally, what is that connection between that security apparatus in Washington, D.C. and Wall Street? So start out, I would suggest, with this fundamental idea of why it was an idea perhaps whose time had not come for this to make more headway, as it were. And finally, the more difficult part of this that you'd need to kind of dig into, and perhaps a work from some speculation. What is that connection between Wall Street and the national security apparatus? And of course, that's a core question we're going to be dealing with throughout the course. So until next time, thank you for joining. So there you have it. And I had the sense that you really, even at that time, you really can't get your heads around it without realizing that what's going on is part of an ancient or cosmic conspiracy. And the conspirators, part of the sort of license they have is that when you, I'll use the words of Father Francois here, when you deal with this conspiracy at the cardinal, and the more you try to address it, and even if you try to address the nature of it here, if you do it in the cardinal, it only empowers it. The book of the Apocalypse talks about this Hydra, this many-headed beast. And if you're just going to cut it off, it grows. And so you can't vote your way out of this. You have to address it at its core. And for Father Francois Chazal, he'd say our world today simply can't acknowledge that this is it's fear that generates everything that's happening. Name the project, monkey situation or immigration, debt. It all comes back that these can't be addressed because of the fear. And that, of course, was put up typologically between the enmity of the two seeds, and the seed of the woman, that is the seed of truth and beauty and power, resurrection and eternal life, can't get anywhere if it doesn't acknowledge that they're living in this fear. So if we're watching the mainstream news and nobody's addressing it, they're living in the fear. And if we're looking now, I guess, what is called the alternative, the same is true. It's just kind of repackaging the mainstream terms, digging into a little bit of this without fundamentally addressing the root of this. Father Chazal would say the victims of this fear lose their wits at a given moment and start to collaborate to their own shackling. And that's what we're at right now. And I think that's the phenomenon of the hope in the cardinal of this world, when all the information is given that that's not the solution. And he goes into a number of remedies for this and how we should address this. And I can't get into all of that here because every word he's saying is pretty explosive. But at the end of the day here, the fear of the Jews is fundamentally worldly. the people that don't like to talk about it or just, don't want to. I mean, if you were to just even today go into what we call the alternative and just say, like, how did two airplanes do this? We're free to talk about a country that allegedly did this and lay them as victims. We're free to do that, but not to actually empirically explore it or go to other conclusions. And so that we even know, okay to criticize this, okay not to it. So we live in this sort of state of exception where we realize that we submit to this fear, realizing there's a state of exception. And deep down, we do know it, but we can't go there. And when we can't go there, all of our concepts of how to make sense of basic reality are skewed. It becomes even worse when you're someone that we put our trust in, the authorities of our societies. And if they can't get that right, everything else is messed up. And that's just at a fundamental level. And so we can't get it right until we get the metaphysics right. Like, where does this power truly come from? And truly, how do you deal with it? Because how we've been dealing with it for the last 70 years is clearly, or I could say 100 years, is clearly not working. So, for example, Father Francois would say Pilate, who nonetheless disliked the Jews, had to yield to them because they control the world. Now, that's almost paradoxical. Certainly the Romans ruled the world's biggest empire that's ever been. And this sort of marginal group in the Mediterranean, how could he suggest that they ruled the world? But in some sense, he knew it. Maybe, they were connected with the people from Carthage, the Phoenicians, and he was aware of that kind of leverage that they had. But he sensed that there was some unique power. And he said, when the crowd went mad, this was a certain power that was unworldly or preternatural, Father Francois would say. And he said, let us stop being attached to this world and we will stop being afraid. And he said, at the core, and I'm sort of going to finish here, not to fear Jews is a detachment. So that's a theme I've been dealing with for a while here on the channel, to be able to identify both at the cardinal and the metaphysical level, what is the cosmic conspiracy against the world, against God and man? And when we identify it, being able to detach from it, because we're powerless once we're dealing with it. If we're dealing with it at a cardinal level, we're only fueling it, would say Francois. And I think what he's saying here is consistent with all the other memory hold concepts we've dealt with in the cosmic conspiracy. But I think here he has a very special insight into this. He said, not to fear Jews, as paradoxical as that may seem, is a wish for them to get well. Not to fear them is a wish for them to get well. And it's not heard that way because when you talk about this stuff, they've been programmed to think you're a hater. People in the church are programmed to think you're a hater. People very close to me said, why do you talk about this subject? Like, what's wrong with you? And he said, so not to fear them is to wish them well, because it is to love them as Christ loved them. As one of the famous saints, including Saint Stephen, armed himself with charity before the Jews, real charity, the kind that banishes fear. And so I can't go into too many of the themes, but he does develop this idea of a demonic mindset. And I'll go into that over on Locals. But ultimately, what he's saying here is that we're living in a state where nobody will touch the subject. And so when you go round and round and talk about everything, the fear porn and everything else that's going on in the world without addressing that, you're simply fueling it. Or in my language, you're digging deep, you're pulling the world deeper in the simulacrum because you're not going to the root of the problem. And that is a love through charity and following in the way of Christ. How did Christ deal with the problem? Face on. He addressed it. And so that's Father Francois, and I'm going to go and do a deep dive into him over on Locals, and I'll leave the link over on Locals. Again, I encourage people to go over there. Membership is free. You can access the Telegraph and some other material over there, and I will be putting much more of especially the touchy kind of material over there, and I hope everybody is doing well. This has been Dr. Deep State.